So thank you so much to the organizers for having me today, and thanks to all of you for joining this discussion. I am sharing comments that come from my years of research with migrant mothers, clinicians, and community leaders in the city of New Haven and the surrounding areas. And that forms the basis of my book work, the book titled Pressing Onward. So this talk particularly focuses on the traumatic experiences mothers endure during their migrations from Latin America, the role of legal violence in the oppression of migrant mothers, the concept of imperative resilience, which I developed to describe how migrant mothers enact psychological, social, and emotional strategies to get by or press onward in their day-to-day lives, and policy solutions to envision more nurturing environments for the patients and families in our care. I value and look forward to your feedback. Miss, I'm very sorry. Lydia halted in her conversation, her voice lacking the easy confidence of earlier. I'm worried that my details could be exposed, and the truth is very concerning, above all for the safety of my family. I reassured Lydia that her information would remain confidential and that she was welcome to share no more than she felt comfortable doing. In Honduras, my husband was a doctor. He worked for the Ministry of Health and for the Attorney General's office. He was the coroner in the area where we lived. What happened is that about a year ago, my husband began receiving anonymous letters at our door. After a couple of months, my husband moved us, saying that it was so I could be closer to my work. But we were only there about a month when he tells me, look, my assignment has been changed and we need to move to the city. I asked myself, how could it be that we just unpacked the last box from our move a few days ago and now we have to move again? My husband said that it was due to his job. So we moved. After about 4 or 5 months, I noticed my husband acting more strangely. He never said anything to me until one morning, before going to work, he woke me up abruptly and said, look, I need to talk to you. He begins to tell me about months of letters threatening him, his job, and our family. That morning, he had found my car with the entire passenger side beaten in, and a note that said, as much as you want to hide, we know where you are, and we know where your wife and son are. The police said they were going to protect us, but it never happened. No one was outside the house. No one knocked on our door to say, we're here in case of any suspicious activity. I mean, nothing, nothing, nothing. We had our tourist visa for the US that we received 3 years prior by the grace of God. We had no choice but to leave. We took one suitcase each. I didn't even say goodbye to my parents. Lydia's husband took a job in landscaping to support them following their move to New Haven. In Honduras, my husband was a professional, a doctor. And now what does he have to do? The changes in his body, in his face, in his hands have been... Lydia's voice trailed off. He comes home and plays with my son, and my son says, Daddy, your hands hurt me. And my husband says, well, yes, look, my hands are hurt. And my son tells him, but don't touch me with your hands, you're hurting me. Lydia's family had applied for political asylum, but according to their lawyer, their case was complicated because they had overstayed their tourist visas. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, their case had not yet been processed when we spoke. We move around with the greatest caution, Lydia said, because we're already here. Illegal, you know? Lydia's story exposes the impact of sociopolitical violence in Latin America and how legal constraints in the US limit their life opportunities. Although some migrants leave their home countries voluntarily out of a sense of adventure or to seek better opportunities, migration often results from the failure of the state to protect its citizens. In these cases, migration may be a life or death decision. Here, I discuss the forms of state failure and violence in Latin America that compel hundreds of thousands to flee each year. Latin American history is pierced by violence. From colonization, African enslavement, and indigenous genocide in the 15th through 18th centuries to political conflicts and brutal dictatorships amid state modernization in the 19th and 20th centuries, and social strife arising from state destabilization in the contemporary period, each era of Latin American history features acts of inhumanity perpetrated by dominant social and political groups against subordinate ones. While this history of violence affects individuals and communities through historic and transgenerational trauma, it is the current sociopolitical upheaval, including assaults and homicides, as well as weak social safety nets, that most directly informs decisions to migrate. This new violence reflects social disruption and the ways that gestures toward democratization have failed to meet the needs of citizens. Lydia detailed the pain of thrusting her 4-year-old son into a strange country. It's so stressful for him to speak English. He asks me, "But mommy, why can't I speak English?" And to everyone on the street, he asks, "Do you speak Spanish? Do you speak Spanish?" He wants to play and interact with others, but he can't. It's so difficult. This decision to migrate is fraught with danger, destabilization, and isolation. Yet the advantages to life in the United States often outweigh the struggles of migration and resettlement. In short, state failure not only drives transnational migration, but it also sustains it. The production and maintenance of an underclass in Latin America, stripped of civic entitlements, spawns a new underclass of illegals in the United States who serve as a cheap and exploitable labor force. But the process of migration itself inflicts its own harms, which I'll share through the narrative of Caridad. "We are 3 or 4 women and 13 men in the group," Caridad said. She was a 34-year-old from Peru. And she told me, "If we had to run, we women knew we'd be left behind." Caridad had spent 3 months traveling from Peru to the Mexican border. She had to pay off multiple soldiers and border guards to arrive safely. They gave us a backpack with water, some fruit, and some canned food. The water was so heavy, I didn't want to carry it. And the canned food was awful. It weighed so much, didn't give much energy, and it made us sick. On the second or third day, I couldn't carry it all anymore, and I left almost everything behind. Another Peruvian man in the group helped me carry my gallon of water. Despite all of that, I became very dizzy. The man took out some oranges and he pressed them to my lips. He told me I needed to go to the river to drink some water, but I couldn't walk, so he carried me on his shoulders and brought me water from the river. We had to hide in holes in the ground from the immigration planes overhead. When Border Patrol found us, the man and I managed to hide in some bushes, but they caught the other woman, the niece of another traveler, and sent her back to Mexico. The uncle crossed back to find her and try again, and then it was just 12 men and me. I tried to lead. I thought, if they start running, where will that leave me? After several more weeks of travel, Caridad arrived in New Haven. "It's safer here. In Peru, they'll shut the lights out on the bus and steal the necklace right off your neck. It happened to me, gave me a huge red mark," Caridad explained. "Here in New Haven, you can carry your purse to the store without worry. Plus, in the summer, it smells like the ocean." Caridad's narrative attests to the physical toll of migrating across the Sonoran Desert. She endured dehydration, exposure, and the precarities of being a woman in groups of mostly men. But Caridad was lucky. She arrived at her destination safely without being detained by immigration authorities. Less fortunate migrants may make multiple attempts to cross after environmental hazards and immigration authorities force them back. Latin American migrant women face dangers such as thievery, rape, assault, kidnapping, extortion, and dehydration. After settling in the United States, many of these women experience intimate partner violence as their social positions make them vulnerable to abuse. Over 75% of Latin American migrant women living in the United States report histories of trauma. Scholars Pereira and Ornelas refer to harrowing migration experiences as painful passages that put migrants at risk of physical and mental harm. Trauma often involves a close encounter with physical violence or death, but trauma also encompasses the emotional response to such experiences, the psychic scars left by these tragic and painful events. Trauma is therefore a clinical and social event in which individuals' subjective memories of trauma shape or rupture their sense of coherence in their lives and may lead to symptoms of mental illness. Migrants, including voluntary migrants, as well as refugees and asylum seekers, are especially susceptible to trauma and its aftermath. Migration-related trauma, a term referring to trauma surrounding departure or displacement from a country of origin and relocation in a destination country, applies to the experiences of many of my interlocutors. I now want to discuss the specific traumas that migrants encounter, specifically the effects of legal violence of immigration enforcement and gender-based violence as factors in health and mental health outcomes. "When I crossed the border, immigration authorities caught me," 19-year-old Isabel recounts. "I had arrived in Arizona, but they took me to Texas. I was there for a whole week. Being in jail was horrible. There were no windows, no way to look outside. If it was night or day, I didn't know. And the food was terrible. They told me it was called La Hielera, the ice box, the place where they locked me up. It was freezing. They gave us these aluminum blankets, which helped a bit, but not much." Isabel went on. There were like 30 or 40 of us locked in the cell. The bathroom was disgusting, in the cell and covered by just a few bricks. It smelled awful. I had no freedom to move about. I was locked in there the whole time. Some of the guards would intentionally wake us up when we were sleeping, banging on the doors. Some just walked around the cell to try to catch us doing something. I conducted my fieldwork at a time when the system and conduct of immigration enforcement came under intensive scrutiny in the United States. In the spring of 2018, the zero tolerance policy against irregular migration imposed by the Trump administration cruelly separated thousands of migrant children from their parents, hundreds of whom have not yet been reunited. This form of judicial punishment lays hold on the soul. Isabel experienced the physical discomfort of crowded conditions, rationing of food, freezing temperatures, and sleep deprivation. But incarceration also has a cumulative, dehumanizing effect. Constant surveillance and the targeting of migrant bodies for disciplinary control grooms them for subservience, docility, and compliance as members of a new American underclass. Migrant bodies also serve as locales of regulation, emphasizing the role of the state in defining legitimacy. The Salvadoran sociologist Cecilia Mejibar Iglesias Abrego proposed the category of legal violence to describe the way that punitive and disciplinary functions of the law harms migrant bodies. They argue that immigration policies purposely construct the status of illegality. U.S. immigration policy has historically engaged racist exclusionary practices that welcome migrants as cheap sources of labor while withholding state protection from them. The 1790 Naturalization Act required each naturalized citizen of the United States to be a free white person of good moral character. This orientation persisted with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese nationals from immigrating or claiming U.S. citizenship, and the 1921 Emergency Quota Act, which set quotas for immigration from countries outside the Western Hemisphere. By contrast, the Immigration Act of 1864 and the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement of 1942, often referred to as the Bracero Agreement, provided for migrant labor to address U.S. worker shortages on farms and in factories. U.S. political leaders have continued to enact laws to allow U.S. employers to access and exploit migrant workers while blocking pathways to full citizenship. In this way, immigration enforcement epitomizes racial capitalism. The subjugation of brown migrant bodies is used to advance neoliberal interests. I now want to turn my attention to gender-based violence, a particular concern for migrant women. One of the guys was a man who was about 50 years old, Jacqueline explained. He told me that I should stay and live with him, that he was going to give me everything, that he wanted to pay me to be his mujer. I told him no, that I had no intention of doing that. And then he pushed me to have sex with him. He told me, if you don't accept, I'm going to leave you out here in the dirt. And he said, you have no one. You have no one here. And now you're in another country, so you can't do anything. He started treating me badly. He stopped paying attention to me, and he would leave me behind and wouldn't wait for me. At one point when we were walking, a very big thorn, like a nail or a screw, got in my shoe and cut up my foot. But the man was already so upset with me, he refused to wait for me. I was scared that he would leave me there, lost in the desert. It was terrifying. Although that guide never directly assaulted Jacqueline, his threats, intimidation, and neglect after she rejected his advances rendered her journey far more precarious. Fear of rape was among the most common concerns for women who crossed the border. In my interviews, I heard many variations of the same dread. Priscilla said, there were those rumors that they touched women. There were also a lot of criminals and groups from other countries, and they began to assault and abuse women. But you take the risk if you want a better life, the life you want to lead. Isabel told me, I thought a coyote would grab us when he was high on marijuana because there were two of us women. I was so afraid he would rape me. Almudena. For women, it was more dangerous because they could abuse us. They assault and abuse you if you're a woman. Although none of the women with whom I spoke reported being sexually assaulted during their crossings, their narratives may selectively omit these experiences as a result of feelings of shame and denial. Many, like Jacqueline, were harassed, intimidated, and threatened with abandonment. Threats of leaving women behind to cope alone in the desert have a ghastly basis in fact. In their study of bodies recovered along the migrant trail, the Binational Migration Institute found that women had nearly 3 times greater odds of dying of exposure relative to men. The plight of women migrants often receives less attention in scholarly work on migration, likely because most individuals apprehended at the border are single men. But women's choices to migrate, intentionally facing the risks of rape and abandonment, highlight their agency. All of my interlocutors recognize the risks. They undertook careful evaluations of their past and their possible future in their decision to engage in the violent process of migration. So, how should we understand the role of threatened violence and the gender differential in risk? Gender-based violence is often invisible. Despite the absence of, even penetrative sexual assault rarely relieves marks on the body. And despite that absence of visible scars, this violence persists into the futures of those who experience it. The anthropologist Carolyn Nordstrom notes that these forms of violence have a tomorrow, leaving behind shattered selves, confidences, futures. The most common trauma symptom reported by my interlocutors was the harboring of strong negative beliefs about the world, such as no one can be trusted and the world is completely dangerous. These enduring attitudes shape the ways women relate to each other, others in their community, and in their new environment in the United States. The nature of these symptoms underscores the limitations of clinical instruments for assessing trauma. The tool I used asked separately about the experience of sexual violence and threats of sexual violence, allowing me to account for that common experience of fear of potential assault. But my index of trauma symptoms did not fully capture the warlike mistrust of others and lingering fear many of my interlocutors carried. After fearing sexual assault at the hands of her polleros, smugglers, confronting theft, and enduring 2 months in immigration detention, Almudena described a psychological state akin to shell shock. Some of these things hurt too much. You could never fully recover, Almudena said. When I first got here, it was different, difficult. Why couldn't I just lead a happy life? I was filled with negativity. Everything bothered me. She paused before continuing. From there, you decide to pull away from people. I stopped talking with my cousins and my friends at work. It was like no one could understand what happened. Such patterns of avoidance and mood change are characteristic of PTSD. Yet Almudena's score was a 2 out of a possible 80. This instrument failed to record her psychological sensitivity in the way that deep ethnographic engagement did. After my interview with Almudena, we spoke about services that would benefit her, as well as the power of being heard. Humanity needs to hear these stories, right? About us immigrant women? Her tone became urgent. People do not know. It is honestly incredible that this is happening in humanity. Why build the walls, right? Or the borders? Without these barriers, so many people would not expose their lives because so many people have died right there in the desert. Why not just give us a permit so you can let us in to work? Her concerns speak to the need for policy reforms and the role that clinicians, scholars, and advocates have in ensuring that services remain open to all migrants who would benefit from them. The racialized violence against migrant bodies continues beyond the border as migrant women seek reproductive care. I now want to talk about the racial power dynamics by which predominantly white providers treat Latina birthers and set the stage for harm, as was the case for Celia. Last Saturday, the pain started. I went into the hospital, but there was no space for me yet. Celia related the beginning of her traumatic birth story with calm resignation. Her older son had been born via C-section, and per her medical records, she had an unknown uterine scar, meaning she did not know, and her obstetricians in Ecuador had not documented where her uterus had been cut. Despite this, Celia consented to a trial of labor after cesarean, TOLAC, 3 months prior to her delivery. In the morning, when Celia arrived at the hospital, she had already begun bleeding. She told me, I had started bleeding. That's why I went in. I was going to wait it out until the pains became stronger, but it was already too much. I went in that same day, but they sent me back. At that time, I was a medical student, and I knew that bleeding late in pregnancy raises concerns for several complications, that clinical guidelines suggest that vaginal bleeding and abdominal pain in women with histories of C-sections, particularly during labor, almost always indicate an emergency. And despite these warning signs, the medical team at the hospital originally turned Celia away. When she returned to the hospital later that night, Celia received an infusion of Pitocin, a synthetic form of the hormone oxytocin, to accelerate her labor. They began the induction on Saturday, and from that night through the morning, the pains were very strong. In the morning, they gave me stuff for the pain, so I had a lot of strong medicine in me, but I told them I couldn't take the pain anymore. The next step, they said, was to inject my back, the medicine they give you when you're going to have a C-section. It was only with that medicine that I was able to endure the pain. Then around 4 p.m, the baby was still in there, and he wasn't coming. Many hours had passed, and I was not dilating normally. I tried pushing, but now there was no way for him to come down. But by that time, it was too late, and the pains were so strong, and I was like, I can't take it anymore. I don't remember very well what happened next, but they were telling my husband that my pain could be because my wound was opening. So they took me away to the operating room in about 10 minutes, and then they realized that it was the wound that had opened. Celia suffered a lateral extension of her original uterine incision, or a broad stretching of the scar that tore open her uterus. Not only this, but both of her uterine arteries, the major blood vessels that supply the uterus, had ripped open. The obstetricians also noted that 4 centimeters of her uterus had thinned so much that her son could be seen through the tissue. Celia's red blood cell volume dropped to a dangerously low level, and she received 2 units of transfused blood. Celia continued, "It was almost as if I had a double birth. I was unrecognizable. The next day after delivery, it was ugly. My entire body was swollen from head to toe. My blood pressure went up. I got dizzy. They took a lot of blood out of me and then had to put blood back in me to be able to recover." Despite these harrowing events, including uterine rupture, postpartum hemorrhage, and postpartum preeclampsia, the attending physician described Celia's C-section as uncomplicated in her discharge summary. The oversimplified label of Celia's C-section as uncomplicated, the medical blunders that occurred during her birth, and her questionable first C-section highlight how obstetric racism takes the dual form of disempowering women through both inadequate care and unwanted intervention. First, Celia was a women's center patient, a label that is often assigned, as I was told, in, quote, a derogatory tone. In other words, Celia came from a safety net clinic and lacked insurance. This, coupled with her inability to speak English fluently, likely contributed to the delay in her admission for labor. Within this care model, as with many other safety net prenatal clinics, patients see a variety of providers for their prenatal care, including midwives, physician assistants, and rarely obstetricians, and then give birth attended by whomever is on call at the time, usually a resident physician who is still in training. These clinical providers were nearly all white, whereas the patients are nearly all Black or Latina, a dynamic I've labeled the prenatal care color line. Celia had no one who could advocate for her. When she arrived at the hospital describing her early labor pains and bleeding, no dedicated provider could follow up and urge her admission. Even if one of her clinic providers had been on call at the time, none of them spoke Spanish and thereby did not fully appreciate the nuance of Celia's experience. Celia lost precious hours, likely during which her uterine tear worsened. Second, at several points, providers underreacted to Celia's complaints of pain. Celia raised concerns of severe pain Saturday night and received no relief until the following morning. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology states that maternal request is a sufficient medical indication for pain relief during labor, and yet Celia suffered hours of pain without medication. Celia initially received an opioid medication, generally disfavored for labor pain given its lower effectiveness and higher risks compared to an epidural. Eventually, Celia did get an epidural, and her labor slowed. During these agonizing hours, the prenatal care color line extended Celia's suffering. Celia's bleeding, severe pain, decrease in uterine tone, and history of prior C-section should have raised red flags for uterine rupture. Her experience raises concerns for racial biases in perceptions of pain and the facility of childbirth. Black and Latinx patients across care settings consistently receive lower quality pain care and are less likely to receive opioids for severe pain. This reality may reflect common racialized beliefs, particularly about Black patients, of their possessing less sensitive nerve endings. I often heard providers at the Women's Center speak about how healthy Latin American patients were and how they rarely needed epidural anesthesia. These efforts are likely well-intended, Trends favoring empowered, natural births and benchmarks of limiting C-sections to reduce unnecessary surgeries and complications may encourage providers to recommend against epidurals and C-sections. Still, Black and Latina women more commonly report stressful birthing experiences and disregard for their preferences. Third, Celia was engrafted in a system of biomedicine that views women, particularly poor women, as pathological, possessors of unruly bodies. In their medical notes, Celia's providers state that she, quote, failed TOLAC and, quote, did not labor, characterizing Celia's body as uncooperative and negating her experience of labor pains lasting more than 24 hours. The reason for her C-section was listed as, quote, the head of the baby was big and it never fit, disregarding the truth of her uterine rupture and the concerning clues of vaginal bleeding and prolonged labor. The medical team attributed the emergency surgery to the anatomy of Celia and her baby, rather than to an expected complication of birth following prior C-section. In this way, the prenatal care color line formed by the racial medical hierarchy enforced essentialist stereotypes of Latina reproduction upon Celia's body, characterizing it as unruly, yet obstetrically hardy, and at fault for its traumatic outcome. Celia's distinctive medical history and presentation were flattened based on her status as a poor, Spanish-speaking Latina, women-centered patient. Clinicians scaled their assessment of risk to the default for obstetrically hardy, poor brown women they imagine desire or deserve fewer medical interventions. Such presuppositions of health or implicit minimization of risk for Latina mothers may contribute to harmful and even life-threatening biases in care practice. Finally, providers, both in Ecuador and in the United States, failed to afford Celia respect for autonomy, violating the first principle of biomedical ethics. Celia had birthed her first child via C-section for reasons that were not clear to her. This experience echoed many of my interlocutors who reported histories of C-sections in their home countries that were either scheduled early in their pregnancies or were ordered for unclear reasons, despite their insistence against them. Although some Latin American and Latina pregnant people may opt for C-section, often they are funneled through this medicalized path without full knowledge of its implications or without active participation in the process. As such, pregnant people like Celia agree to this massive abdominal surgery, not understanding whether it was truly medically indicated and how it might affect their future birth plans. Over-medicalization, as with denial of necessary medical care, increases risk of adverse reproductive health outcomes and disproportionately harms Black and brown birthing people. Such disempowerment constitutes a form of transnational obstetric violence that follows migrants as they journey across borders. When Celia consented to TOLAC despite her unknown uterine scar and unclear obstetric history, she did not have the details she needed to make an informed decision about her birth plan. Her vulnerability, considering this incomplete clinical picture, should have entitled her to even more cautious communication about her options during her prenatal care and a timely response to her concerns at the time of her birth. Instead, she found herself desperately confused, her requests denied, and clinging to her own life, let alone the life of her newborn. Here, the obstetric racism enforced by the prenatal care color line endangered and dehumanized Celia. Her traumatic birth highlighted her treatment as an undeserving, poor, obstetrically hardy Latina woman, despite the particularities of her medical history, revealing the bipartite structure of obstetric racism that deprives women of agency by denying them care when they need it and forcing care upon them when they do not fully consent. I found myself in awe of these women who, despite immense economic adversity and limited social support, seemed astonishingly okay, despite such harrowing traumatic histories. This prompted me to reflect on my conventional understanding of resilience. Though definitions vary, resilience generally refers to engaging resources in the face of adversity to achieve goals. Resilience considers social environment as a factor influencing an individual's ability to adapt to difficult life circumstances. Terms like resilience often imply well-being and positive or protective factors, or at least an absence of psychopathology, which lend themselves to measurement using pre- and post-intervention assessments in behavioral health research. Nearly all scholars of resilience in clinical medicine, public health, and related social sciences agree that resilience should be optimized and seek to pinpoint the ways that it can be cultivated. This interpretation of resilience fixes the concept as a static characteristic, akin to toughness or grit, rather than as a process of rational action. A more nuanced conceptualization of resilience views it as a trajectory or a process of adaptation or sustained healthy adjustment over time. When I talked about resilience and its relevance to this project with my research assistants, several cringed. At La Casa Cultural, which is the Latinx Cultural Center at Yale, we talk a lot about resilience, like it's something white people think we should have for making it here. It's a comment from one of my students. But that's not it at all. I mean, we're resilient because we have to be. We joked that the response to, wow, you're so resilient, should be thanks. It was between that and dropping out or dying. Theories of resilience tend not to conceptualize it as a mode of resistance to oppression, but my interlocutors reveal that this is exactly the dynamic at work. Resilience is not an ability or a choice. It is a conditioned response to the multiple forms of violence they encounter through racism, sexism, and immigration enforcement, and economic inequality. In recognition of this reality, I propose the term imperative resilience to describe the strategies that women employ cognitively, emotionally, and socially to get by in the face of overlapping adversities. Priscilla, for example, told me that she could not afford to let her emotional responses interfere with her ability to handle stress. Instead, she focuses on problem solving. Let's say I do not have something that I should, she explained. For example, this month, I had only half the money I needed to pay the electric bill. I couldn't make that bill this month, and so next month, I'm going to have to work more hours to cover it. If I get angry about it, things will just get worse. It won't solve anything. So I just try to calm down and look for solutions to be more economical and more organized. Priscilla seemed almost puzzled by my questions about how she bounces back from stress or other difficulties in life. I try to keep things simple, she responded. If I complicate things, I'm not going to solve anything at all. If I complicate things, I get home in a bad mood and I take it out on my children, but they're my responsibility. I have to be the responsible one. If I get angry and yell and scream to let off steam, it solves nothing in the end. Quite the opposite. It makes things worse. I just have to calm down and look for solutions. I have to accept and endure. These themes of acceptance and endurance and the desire to shield children from stress echoed throughout my interviews. Women felt it was their responsibility to minimize their affective responses to difficult circumstances to preserve the emotional and physical health of their children and their pregnancies. At first glance, the coping strategies employed by Priscilla might be seen as maladaptive and described clinically as emotional numbing, repression, and cognitive avoidance. However, women like Priscilla also employ positive coping strategies, including problem solving, benefit finding, altruism, and personal or spiritual growth. Although Priscilla might suppress her emotional reactions to stress, she does so out of concern for her children. She focuses on practical solutions to her challenges, like adjusting her budget and work hours. We can characterize these strategies for survival as imperative resilience. This is a performance that becomes actualized through practice. The necessity of suppressing negative emotions, emphasizing the positive, and strategic problem solving reflect not an inherent grit or toughness, nor special access to social and material resources. Rather, it arises as a form of opposition to social injustice, a way of summoning personal and social capacity to fill the voids left by society. The experiences of my interlocutors point to necessary policy reforms. First, we need universal health care for our migrant communities that includes adequate behavioral and mental health services. In my state of Connecticut, recent legislation has expanded our state Medicaid, called Husky, to children up to age 12. And a proposed bill for this legislative session would extend that to age 18, but the state has not yet committed to funding the expansion. We can do better. Second, we need provisions for basic needs like food, housing, and diapers, whether through universal basic income or the expansion of services that we have in the United States like SNAP and TANF to non-citizens. Third, we need a clear and accessible pathway to lawful migration. One solution, which involves updating the migration registry, which has not been touched in 40 years and previously received bipartisan support, would adjust the status of an estimated 8 million undocumented residents. In this conversation, I have attempted to consolidate hundreds of hours of conversations to highlight the global and local forces that constrain women's life opportunities and how they push against those to meet their goals. I want to emphasize a few points. First, the disintegration of democratic institutions in Latin America, largely due to unequal trade relations and the war on drugs, such that these governments neither exercise effective control over force nor provide adequate social support, breeds mistrust and fear and forces women to migrate. Second, migration entails its own experiences of trauma, migration-related trauma, that includes detention and sexual assault and fear of those. Legal violence then grooms migrants for subservience as members of an American underclass. Third, the process of giving birth in the United States submits Latinx pregnant people to a process of racialization that is enforced by a prenatal care color line, by which predominantly white providers characterize the physiology and pathology of brown migrant bodies. Fourth, conventional public and mental health approaches may view few symptoms, or the absence of them, as evidence of resilience, but I argue that this is a necessary conditioned response or resistance to the multiple overlapping oppressions of legal violence, racism, gender-based violence, and economic oppression. Fifth, the term I propose to describe this is imperative resilience, and it describes the cognitive, social, and emotional strategies women use to get by in the day-to-day, to seguir adelante, or press onward. Finally, no woman should be forced to rely on her own intrinsic abilities to survive and build a better life for herself and her family within a hostile environment. She deserves to be supported and have enough capacity to grow her self-worth and invest in her dreams. Policy reforms like pathways to legal immigration, basic income and housing support, and universal healthcare can make this a reality. In the following animation, I summarize some of these key findings, using the metaphor of the monarch butterfly to illustrate the imperative resilience of Latina migrant mothers.
When the weather turns and the milkweed wilts, monarch butterflies lift their wings and embark on a perilous migration from the United States to Mexico in search of nectar. In the face of deforestation and climate change, they journey for their survival and for the survival of their offspring. Theirs could be a story of suffering, but I see it as one of power and persistence. Like the monarchs, mothers who migrate from Latin America to the United States face extreme obstacles. They craft their futures and the futures of their children despite devastating inequality, harmful politics, and a global pandemic. They too can be seen as sufferers. Instead, I see resistance. I call this imperative resilience, a strategic approach to push onward, or seguir adelante. Imperative resilience sounds like Adelina telling me, whenever something seems stressful, I just don't think about it. I'm just like, there's going to be another day when you can make it better. Or Elvira explaining, you just have to accept it and adapt. Create something nice out of it so you don't have to focus on the bad. It looks like hand-picked partnerships that provide the support mothers need to fulfill their family's goals. It feels like a spark when that moment of prayer or spiritual song carries a message from God. It echoes through the wisdom passed on by mothers and grandmothers to help their daughters dream bigger. But just like a cold snap shocks the monarchs, the COVID-19 pandemic devastated migrant mothers. These women lost work and shuttered themselves at home to protect their children. They watched loved ones contract the virus and die. As Jacqueline puts it was like a trauma. I was afraid of what would happen if I got sick. For 3 months, I didn't go out at all. We kept hearing about people dying. Women like Jacqueline need the essentials like food, diapers, and healthcare. They need protection against domestic violence and a clear pathway to citizenship. Policymakers must build a more nurturing home for these migrant women. In New Haven, Connecticut, a longtime refuge for migrants, children build monarch way stations where the butterflies refuel during their long migration. Like the monarchs, we do not have to force migrant women to suffer or starve. We can work together to create a more nourishing and equitable home for our neighbors.
So if you enjoyed this and you're curious about more, particularly the impacts of COVID-19 on the migrant mothers I interviewed, which I did not have the opportunity to share with you today, feel free to find my book, Pressing Onward, The Imperative Resilience of Latina Migrant Mothers. And that's a discount code with a QR code to access it, to be able to get it cheaper. And I just want to thank you all again. And I really look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cerdeña. That was a really beautiful presentation that I think gives so much humanity to your participants and really reminds us of the really huge but important policy opportunities that we need to seize upon if we want to create more equitable conditions for migrant mothers. I want to remind our participants that you can use the Q&A box to pose questions to Dr. Cerdeña. And while you think about your questions, I wonder if I could ask you a bit more about the policy recommendations toward the end of your presentation. I think for those of us here in Canada, we are often looking at, for instance, President Biden's recent announcement that looks to me like a regression in the kinds of immigration policies that are sorely needed. And there's kind of a sense of worry, sometimes a feeling of doubt about policies moving in the right direction. But I wonder if you see some policy windows or opportunities, places where your work can really be taken up to explore new types of policies or new ways of supporting migrant mothers that maybe we don't see in the day-to-day news cycle.
Absolutely. So I can first highlight some successes. So one was when the Violence Against Women Act was passed in the 1990s. It actually did not specify criteria for documentation status. And in that way, women who migrated and then subsequently experienced different forms of intimate partner violence, which we know is incredibly common because women come here, they are economically oppressed, they are in imbalanced gender dynamics, they are susceptible to employment exploitations because of their undocumented status. That led to a lot of, we still see a lot of widespread intimate partner violence, but through the Violence Against Women Act, women were able to access a green cards by basically reporting that intimate partner violence and supporting kind of the judicial action against perpetrators. Which is a very challenging thing because, as we know, and I'm speaking to a group of gender scholars, that is a very challenging thing to actually achieve, but it provided an opening, and at least one of my interlocutors had used it successfully. Also, I will say that there's a recent announcement by the Biden administration saying that they are extending or basically kind of adjusting the process by which people who are married to US citizens can obtain legal status. So basically by the former process, people were eligible to apply for a green card or permanent residency, but because many of them had committed misdemeanors by entering the country unlawfully or by overstaying tourist visas, they would be required to return to their home countries for up to 10 years as kind of a barring on their reentry into the United States so that they can come back in with that designated status. And the recent announcement is basically getting rid of that 10-year ban for many people. And that is another strategy that I think is really helpful. At the same time, we are seeing horrific changes in border enforcement, particularly in Texas along the Rio Grande, and kind of this, which seems to be quite criminal, setting caps on processing of asylum seekers at the border, which it remains a very controversial topic, and it is of ongoing debates, kind of divided along partisan lines. But it kind of shows how we've gone in a more draconian direction overall in terms of this. The policy that I spoke about is called the Migration Registry. So this basically is a system by which people who have been present in the United States for a period of 8 to 10 years, prior iterations of the legislation have varied on the actual specified time frame. They've been in the country for 8 to 10 years. They can demonstrate that they've been in the country for this long, and they've been contributing members, working, not committing any crimes, and so on. basically adjusts that time and says, okay, let's say from 2014 onward, if you've been here since that time, then you can have access to a green card. And that was a policy that was used throughout the 20th century to basically expedite processing and simplify the pathway for many migrants, and it always received bipartisan support. It has not been touched since the 80s, I believe. And that also reflects the kind of increasing partisan divide around issues of immigration. To me, if you poll Americans, they will say that they want people who are working and contributing to society to be present lawfully. It actually shows a lot of benefits for kind of labor organizing, increasing wages, and so on. Because basically, once you have an exploited class, then the bar just drops. And yet, we see that this migration registry has not been touched. So that is one key policy thing that I would point to. The last thing that I'll say is about healthcare. So this is a situation where the United States is quite different from Canada. But basically, with the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, undocumented migrants were explicitly barred from being able to access healthcare markets. That means that the only way that they can get their health coverage paid for is if they have a life-threatening condition and can apply for emergency Medicaid, or in some cases, in pregnancy. And that also requires undocumented migrants to alert the government of their status, basically saying like, hey, like I'm not eligible for these different systems. So like, here's my address, here's my phone number, here's the way to get in touch with me. And it kind of puts a lot of people in a very compromising position. There are a lot of also privately funded programs, which many of the women in my study benefited from, to be able to access kind of support for healthcare costs. But there are also states like California, like Connecticut, like New York, that have passed pieces of legislation to basically say that Medicaid can include undocumented people up to certain ages. In California, it's up to age 26. They're actually working on expanding it to age 55. In New York, any undocumented migrant in New York City specifically can access healthcare at the public institutions for free without any costs. And in Connecticut, as I mentioned, currently it's undocumented children up to age 12. And there have been attempts to expand it to age 26. And then we dropped the target to age 18 and we're still not getting the funding for it. But that's like another way that basically taking it on as a more local initiative to be able to provide healthcare for migrants.
That's great. Thank you. I mean, it just really goes to show like the various ways in which policy opportunities can open. And I actually think there's a lot for us to learn from what you just broke down for us here in Canada, because there are many places in Canada, including here in Vancouver, where undocumented people will find it very difficult to access affordable care. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from what you're describing. I wonder if I can ask you a little bit more about imperative resilience. So I really loved hearing how you arrived at that concept in your research and how you defined it. As a researcher who works with folks who are marginalized on the basis of cis heterosexism, I often feel a little bit uncomfortable with how the concept of resilience is mobilized in research. And so I really liked what you offered as, kind of how people are making sense of what they must do to survive despite where society has failed to support them. I wondered if, just because you're also a physician, I wondered if you might talk a little bit about how this could apply in a clinical context. Like, I almost felt like a point you were getting to was that maybe clinicians could use this concept to respond to their patients differently by better understanding the kind of contexts around migrant experiences. I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but I'd just love to hear like what that could look like in the clinic.
That is absolutely right. And I think that when I talk to, exclusively clinical audiences, I really speak about the empowering role that we have in these dynamics, because we are taught in medicine to see healthy, unhealthy, sick, not sick, pathological or physiological. And it is so much more complicated than that. And I think the key point is that just because someone is not crossing a threshold for a clinical syndrome does not mean that they are not worthy and experiencing something that merits attention, services, resources, etc. And too often we're like, oh, well, throw my hands up, like the numbers are the numbers. And that is where these magical terms of clinical judgment and, and the role of advocacy really speak up, because we accumulate a lot of social and cultural capital in medicine, in research, in academia, and we should empower ourselves to be more critical of these very defined cut points. And this basically just speaks to how we need to cede more of our power in these dynamics. Now, with every woman I spoke with, because of my access to, different services and the phone calls that I could make and the way that I could get in touch with people, I talked with everyone about whether they were getting enough services. And I delivered food boxes to people and put people in touch with on-call clinical providers and set people up with appointments, all of that stuff. But some would say, no, I'm good. And that is also an important thing to respect. Even people who meet these clinical criteria might not be what they need in their lives right now. And then it's kind of thinking beyond that, because, our mental health care is very individualized. It doesn't always account for, family structures, the experience of intergenerational and transgenerational trauma, all of those things. And that might not be the right fit for someone. But it's also important to consider what the potential costs are if we do not consider people eligible for services. And that means that migrant women can be deported. They can be committed to psychiatric facilities against their will. They can lose their children. They can have kind of, family separation imposed upon them. So it is extremely high stakes. So just because someone is in front of you and they're not checking your boxes, or they're not, getting that high number that says that they, are at severe risk, does not mean that we should not be thinking thoughtfully and creatively and working with and asking, what would help you in this moment? And then listening and realizing, okay, in this clinical encounter, I am not going to be able to give you more money. I'm not going to be able to stop your employer from exploiting you. But I can think about the macro level factors that are contributing to those conditions and use my position, my title, what I've built over my time, just by virtue of access of the training that I've had, to advocate for something different. And that is what I want to empower everyone here to do.
I love that. Thank you so much. I particularly love that concept around, really ceding power, space, resources, and taking a more humble listening role. It reminds me of folks in narrative medicine who talk about this kind of mismatch between what the clinician thinks the patient's journey should be and what the patient is actually going through. We have time for one last question, and one of your audience members is saying, first of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. The quotes and stories you shared are powerful, and this person is wondering, how did you approach your interviews to create a place for people to share their vulnerability and personal stories?
That is always the challenge in conducting qualitative ethnographic research. And I will say that one thing that helped was acknowledging my own vulnerability, because so often we seem in research that we are following the protocol and we have it all together and it's all perfect. But at the time that I was doing these interviews, I was also shuttered inside because of the pandemic. I was trying to raise a tiny human and was struggling doing it despite all the supports that I had. And without kind of, going too much into, self-disclosure, navel gazing, speaking about wow, I hear you. I get that. This is something that I've shared too, and kind of trying to take off all of the formalities and the kind of again, breaking down that power differential to be I may not be like you in every respect, but we have a lot of things that we share, and I'm in this with you as much as I can be. And I think that changed the conversation so much. I mean, when when I would be meeting people and I would have my like little kiddo, or if I conducted some interviews over the phone because of the pandemic and they would like hear him screaming in the background, and I would be like, give me just a second, I'm going to take care of this. Like then the next conversation would be like, oh my gosh, and I didn't even tell you, you know, what it's been like trying to care for my family and try to get work and being worried about exposing myself to the virus and bringing it back home. Like, let me tell you about that. And then it just would open these kinds of windows. So I just encourage people to again engage like this humility and vulnerability, and recognizing that, you know, so often we study, you know, along these power axes, and we can level that out a lot more by acknowledging our own vulnerabilities.
Thank you. That's really beautiful, and reminds me that this whole notion of like, you know, objectivity and like one path to methodological rigor is really just not accurate when it comes to describing good research and good work.
1000%, I agree.
So please join me in thanking Dr. Cerdeña one more time. Really, this was such a wonderful way to end our 2023-2024 speaker series. So really appreciate your contributions, and really appreciate the policy work you're doing, the care that you're giving to your patients and your participants. And I wish you all a great summer, and keep in touch, and we'll see you next year.